One very quick thing. Has somebody else got a? Anybody got a mic on? Oh, that's better. Perhaps I'm oversensitive. I don't know whether you want to move forward. It does seem a long way back there, but if you are happy to sit there, fine. Otherwise, if somebody's a little bit hard of hearing or whatever, then please come forward. So, no, it's no better, is it?
We need the screen down.
No. Why am I getting an echo? Any idea?
Fiona, if you turn the volume down on the computer in front of you, it's Kimberly on Zoom, Chairman.
Thank you.
Turn the volume down, it should stop the feedback a little bit.
Let's try that. Is that no? Yes, that's better. Okay, can you all hear me now?
That's better.
Good, thank you very much. Do we want our screens on so we can see Zoom?
You could come and sit here, Chairman. This is fine.
I can still hear it. Okay, anyway, let's start this meeting, please. This is, as you know, being broadcast. Is it on?
Yes.
So we are now live to the public. So I will start the meeting now, please. So on the agenda, first of all, apologies for absence.
Thank you, Chairman. I've had apologies from Councillor Cossa and also Tom Hughes and Stephen Reynolds, who are the Parish Council co-optees. There's no items on the agenda in which they could vote this evening, so they've opted to give apologies.
Thank you. And have we any substitutes?
No substitutes.
Thank you. We'll go on to the minutes then. Can I confirm the minutes of the meeting which took place on the 25th of April? I wasn't here, so I will ask you all to vote on that. Are you happy and content with the minutes? Thank you. On to item 3, disclosures of interest. Is there any councillor wishes to disclose an interest? I can't see any hands, so I assume nobody does. Questions by members of the public. Fiona, have we any questions by members of the public?
No questions from members of the public and no questions from councillors either.
Thank you very much. So we'll go on now to the main bulk of the meeting, obviously. The monitoring officer matters. There's no monitoring officer matters to report. So the constitution is review of the Waverley Constitution, which is item 6, pages 5 to 228. Now, we all know this is quite a very large document, and I would like to publicly thank the officers for getting it out like this. I think most of us have read it, and I don't remember seeing too many problems. So let's hope that we can get through this tonight in a reasonable speed. And councillors, please, I would ask you, as we always do, please, if you can avoid repetition, and indeed, if you can keep succinct to your questions, it would help a lot of people, particularly myself and the officers' time. So this report proposes a revised Waverley's constitutions, part 1 to 4, which the Standards and General Purposes Committee is asked to consider and recommend to full council for approval. So if I directly open it up, I will just ask if there are any questions from the officers first.
No questions. Mr. Taylor was going to do a short intro, and Councillor Hyman has registered to speak on this item, and he is on Zoom.
Thank you. So, Mr. Taylor.
Thank you, Chair. So the report proposes revisions to Waverley's constitution, which the committee is asked to recommend to full council for approval. The requirement for local councils to have a constitution was introduced by the Local Government Act 2000. Waverley adopted its first constitution in 2001, and like most councils, this was based on a model constitution at that time, set out within a number of parts. So you will be familiar with the structure, as we're all very used to it, comprised of parts 1 to 4, the explanation and summary, articles, responsibility for functions, and procedure rules, and it's those procedure rules which have been the focus of these proposed revisions. It also has additional parts 5, 6 and 7, but those have not been part of this review. The structure of the model constitution lends itself to some duplication between the different parts. Incremental adjustments over the years have led to some internal inconsistencies, and it's been one of the aims of this review to try and resolve those. There are some errors and omissions reflecting changes in law and regulations over the last 20 plus years, and overall the document has become slightly difficult to navigate as a result of incremental changes along the way. Arguably, it's got to the point where it's not as useful as it should be. So at the request of full council officers, and in particular, I have to acknowledge the hard work done by Fiona Cameron, the council's senior governance officer, has carried out a thorough review of the constitution and proposed these changes that you see within your papers today. The review has included a cross-check against all elements required to be included under statute and regulations. I hope you'll recall that the terms of reference for the review were agreed previously by this committee, but as a reminder, the intention has been to update the constitution, to take out any errors or omissions, to resolve internal inconsistencies where these occur, to remove any outdated references, to include or restore any omitted procedure rules, to reduce repetition between the different parts, particularly by greater signposting in part 1, rather than repeating the same text throughout the document, to improve navigation and usability, and to improve accessibility and inclusion. And this has included formatting updates to meet the recent web content accessibility guidelines for online navigation, and also to include gender neutral language as a standard. Annex 1, which was circulated to all members, sets out the schedule of changes. You will have noted that most of these are relatively minor and they don't change the substance of the constitution, but I would like to briefly draw attention to a few of the more substantive changes that are included. Firstly, removing the requirement to present committee meetings to council as part 1 and part 2 items. It is proposed instead that recommendations to full council be included on the council agenda as standalone items. The policy framework is proposed to be streamlined to only include the legal requirements, because the policy framework otherwise is almost always out of date as soon as it's written. Proposed changes to Article 12, which relates to decision making, and these would introduce a level of mandatory training for councillors sitting on planning, licensing, standards and audit committees. It's proposed that committee terms of reference be set out in part 3 rather than across parts 2 and 3. The audit committee terms of reference have been updated in line with discussions held previously with the audit committee, which is good to see. The general purposes functions of this committee have been included and expanded to reflect what this committee now does. The description of the executive responsibilities have been revised again to reflect legislation and being described as being everything that isn't in the remit of the council rather than trying to define them separately, which again can lead to errors, but also to confusion. It's proposed to define the annual budget council meeting as a separate type of meeting. This was something which was suggested by a number of councillors and would have, amongst other benefits, the benefit of easily limiting non-budget business on the agenda. And that's in light of some of the recent meetings and the feedback we've had about those meetings. The budget and policy framework procedure rules and officer employment procedure rules are proposed within the papers. Officer employment procedure rules relate to the arrangements for employment of chief officers. Since these are now joint posts with Guildford, the procedure rules will need to align with Guildford's arrangements. Officers are meeting with Guildford colleagues later this week to progress this, and in the event that we're unable to finalise these before Waverley's full council, officers suggest that council could be asked to delegate authority to the monitoring officer to complete that section. That's my introduction, Chairman. I'm happy to pick up any questions, and as I say, ably supported by Fiona, who does need to be given credit for leading on this very detailed piece of work. I'd like to personally thank her for all the work that she's done, returning to her post and doing this excellent piece of work. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that summary. We'll now go on to the questions from councillors. I shall now throw it open, please. I can take Councillor Hart, yes, because you're not a member of the committee, is he? Is he? I know I can't see him on Zoom.
He's on Zoom. Councillor Hyman, yes, he's just unmuted himself.
Councillor Hyman, I'm told you're on. Ah, there he is. Yes, he's magically appeared on Zoom. So, Councillor Hyman, as I understand it, you have 4 minutes. So, if you like,
thank you, Chairman. I'd be happy to wait until members have had their chance to speak, if you like, so I don't steal their thunder. It'd be helpful. No, okay.
Go ahead now, thank you.
Yes, I think that there's some very much needed and some valuable changes which are being proposed here within what's in front of us. But I note from paragraph 4.4 on page, excuse me, I've got a number of documents I have to have open doing it in page 6 of your documents. Paragraph 4.4 tells us that the structure's been retained. There has been considerable redrafting of the text. And it says where substantive changes are proposed, these are summarised in the attached annex, which to follow, which I've also got open there, and I'm sure members have had a look at. The issue here, of course, is that what it's telling us is that there are a lot of changes to the text been made, which are not considered to be substantive. And how can we know that without a track changes document? I do think, obviously, there are issues here which have to be addressed as a matter of time constraint. Which is the changes of the names and changes which are due to the collaboration project largely in management names and that sort of thing, and they do have to be put through. I understand. Now, unfortunately, what I've seen, it looks to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, please, that those have been that those haven't been finished yet, so we don't really have those in front of us. Having looked through, I've seen lots of typos, lots of formatting changes and things that need to be done to those, and I do think that it would be a good idea, actually. Are we the sort of council that makes wholesale changes to its constitution without knowing all the changes that are being made? And I would very much hope that everybody on the committee would say, no, of course we're not. We don't make decisions blind and without consideration of any possible consequences or risks to the council or to our business or whatever. So, I mean, my first question would be: can anyone here, can anyone in the chamber or wherever on this call, can anyone here tell us all of the changes that are being made? Because without a track changes document, I don't think we can, and I think that's absolutely vital for council. Because how can I or anybody else refer to changes that are being made if we created a track changes document ourselves? How could we, without that being available to all other councillors? We simply can't discuss any other changes that are being made other than the ones that are being identified to us. So please prove my concern unfounded by providing a track changes document before you agree to this, other than the changes which are time limited in respect of changing titles. We've got to be extremely careful when removing members' rights, which are residents' rights. Residents have a right to stand as councillors, and when they become councillors, they've got a right at the moment to be able to speak, to be able to make motions to the council. Now, I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong again, that's being changed to it would require 3 councillors if you're a member of a party, which disadvantages all members except for independents, who don't have to obey that rule, of course. And that's removing the rights of residents, unfortunately, and I can't agree to that. And I wouldn't imagine any other Farnham residents members who are independents would like the idea that people who might join our party and stand for us would be disadvantaged by doing so. And so obviously that's something which is
30 seconds, Councillor Hyman.
Thank you very much. So the issue there is it a problem? Do we have a problem? How much time has been wasted by not having that rule in place? Because I really don't think it's a problem. And the other issue, I think, which I identified, was the requirement that ward members no longer have a right to call in. Am I right in that? That's what it seems at first sight. I really haven't had time to go through it in detail. If so, again, that's removing a right. So I would ask, please.
Thank you, Councillor Hyman.
Before
what we'll do now, obviously the typos you mentioned, most of us saw typos and actually phoned the office prior to the meeting to make sure they were aware of the typos, and I believe they've been corrected. Now, you raised, I think it was 3, maybe 4 questions. Did you get those questions, Fiona?
Yes.
Sorry, yes, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Councillor Hyman, with regard to the track changes, the document, there is a track change version. It is very, very complicated and very difficult to read because of the amount of formatting changes, never mind text. There's a number of, or a great deal, when I describe them as textual changes, but without them being substantive in terms of changing rights or powers and responsibilities. They're more descriptive. It's sort of changing the way parts of the document are phrased rather than sort of changing the substance. So I think I would encourage you to read it as, does it read as a coherent document rather than in detail tracking every single textual change that's in the document. But as I say, I do have a track change version if you particularly want to see that. With regards to motions, the aim of that was to try and ensure that at least when a motion comes to council, when it's put forward on proposed by a councillor, we at least have a seconder for that, rather than it taking up time on the council agenda and then there being no seconder. The committee did consider that in an informal briefing, and we're happy with that, but that will be up to the committee and council to decide. And you were cut off on the point about call-in, but I'm not aware of any area where we're removing a right of call-in by councillors. I'm not sure whether that's in relation to planning committees or overview and scrutiny, but there's been no change. Or if something reads as though there's been a change to call-in arrangements, that's poor drafting on my part rather than any intent to remove any rights of councillors. Hope that's helpful.
Thank you, Fiona. Right, now, are there any other questions from people outside the council, Fiona?
No.
Okay, in that case, we move on to councillors. If you'd like to ask questions, please. I have Councillor Baker first.
Thank you, Chairman. I will confine myself to questions. There might be some things I would like to support as well. I leave it up to you, Chair, to decide when I should say those things. I would like to say one thing first. I do congratulate Fiona Cameron on what she's done. I just think it is a fabulous piece of work, and that the Constitution, if adopted pretty much as it is now, is actually worthy of Waverley. If you see what it was like originally, the difference is amazing, and I'm sure it was done very methodically and was a lot of hard work. So I'd like to say thank you. There was one question I had really about the quorum numbers. So that is getting down to the nitty-gritty. I see somewhere that it says that the quorum for full council would be 1/4 of the members, and that was specified as 15. So I took that as the rule for the quorum for all the other meetings that we might have. And in some of the other meetings, the groups are quite small to begin with. So you get down to 3 members who are going to make a decision, maybe only a recommendation, but nevertheless, I thought that maybe 3 members was not quite enough. But I don't know what the rule of thumb is. I don't know if there is a rule of thumb. So that's one question I have, whether for some meetings it should be greater than 3.
Let's answer that one now before we get out lost of it. Fiona, have you got an answer?
I do have an answer for that one. You're quite correct that for council, it's 1/4 of the member, 1/4 of the whole number of members, so it's rounded up. So 57 councillors rounds up to 60. So that's where we get the 15. And that is set out in, I think it's the Local Government Act 1972, that particular one. The other committees are committees of council, so they follow the same rule unless council decides otherwise. I agree that some of them are quite small, sort of 3s and 4s. And it is within council's sort of gift to decide that the quorum for those should be higher. My suggestion would be given that we've been operating on that basis for a good number of years, perhaps to leave it until the spring of next year. You'll be aware that as a result of the boundary review, the size of the council is being reduced to 50 members from the current 57. And I think that will necessitate the council to review the size of some of its committees anyway, that there's the number that potentially can be on the executive remains at 10. So that means that instead of there being 47 backbenchers to fill a lot of these committee spaces, there's only going to be 40. So you might want to review the size of the committees. So perhaps you're meeting in the spring to make a recommendation to council, and that might be an appropriate time to look at the quorum of the committees as well. So my suggestion would be that, given that we've lasted this long with the numbers that the same numbers as in the constitution, we perhaps leave that and do it at the same time as reviewing the number of councillors or the size of the committees.
Thank you. And your second question, I'm going on to Councillor Marriott and Councillor Ward.
May I carry on, Chair? Sorry.
Yes, ask your second question. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I have a statement. I was glad to see the arrangements for substitution clarified. And beyond that, Chair, my concerns about the arrangements regarding the monitoring officer, I think, have been somewhat overtaken by an email from the Chief Executive clarifying when certain arrangements are actually coming into force. So I wondered, because there were concerns about what was happening to the monitoring function. Was it going to be left in midair because the monitoring function is under this new constitution would be within the domain of the head of legal services, and we haven't got a head of legal services at the moment. My understanding from the Chief Executive's email is that Mr. Taylor is to continue with the monitoring function until such time as this constitution comes into force. And that does lead me to another question. When, especially in view of my question about the quorum numbers, when does this come into force? It's a bit confusing because we've got the joint management team set out here, which was circulated to everybody. And that seems to be in force from the 1st of October. And I'm sure you've seen that. But I don't know how that ties up with the new constitution, because it all seems to be highly relevant. So yes, so could I have clarification? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Baker. Mr. Taylor, you wanted to answer that?
I'm happy to clarify that. So there's a number of things there, and actually we need to look at each of them separately. So in terms of the monitoring officer arrangements, what the Chief Executive has clarified is that I remain the monitoring officer until such time as a new monitoring officer is appointed. So the expectation is that there will be an interim monitoring officer appointed, and when that happens, I stop being the monitoring officer. That's an arrangement I'm aware of and perfectly happy with. In terms of the scheme of delegation, I have, as monitoring officer, delegated authority to make adjustments to the scheme of delegation purely to reflect changes in structure and changes in job title. So I have used my delegated authority to make sure that when the joint management team arrangements came into force, which they did today, that all of the existing authorities that have already been granted by Waverley's full council are simply relisted underneath the correct person and the correct job title. So I haven't added, removed or adjusted any of those authorities. I've simply used my own delegated authority to tidy it up so that everybody is clear who can exercise that delegated authority under the new joint management structure. Everything else that you see in front of you today in these papers are proposed changes to the Constitution that officers have put forward because we were asked by full council to lead on this review, working with you as the Standards and General Purposes Committee. And those don't take effect. Well, firstly, they don't take effect until you've had a look at them and decided what you put forward to full council, but they don't take effect until full council agrees whatever you do put forward to them. So there are three separate things there. They are interconnected, but particularly on the last one, nothing's been changed without your say so, and it won't actually be adopted until Waverley's full council decides that it is adopted. So I hope that clarifies, Chairman.
Thank you. Councillor, Councillor Marriott, please.
Thank you, Chair. I have a question and a comment. The question is concerning item section 4.3, item C on page 81. Well, it talks about the roles of proceedings, and the sentence says liaise with executive members as appropriate. I just wonder whether that's a little loosely defined. I'm actually thinking really in terms of the role of the Audit Committee, and we had discussions about how that might work in relation to decisions that the executive make. So I don't see that in this constitution.
Thank you, Fiona.
Is that specifically in relation to the Audit Committee that you're querying? Yes. So the Audit Committee terms of reference, you'll have noticed we have expanded those to take into account the SITFA model terms of reference that the Audit Committee discussed some time ago now. And I'm just trying to find them. I thought there was a line in there about committee being able to pick up anything that was referred by the chief executive, yes, to review any issue referred to it by the joint chief executive, section 151 officer, joint monitoring officer, or any council body. Were you looking for something more detailed than that?
I think it needs, from my point of view, would need definition of how that role is undertaken.
Right. I'm sure we can come up with some wording for that if the committee wanted to do that. Either by adding something into the terms of reference or some kind of protocol. In the way that, for example, we've done with the Overview and Scrutiny Committee, there's a protocol there for how the executive and the chairs of the Overview and Scrutiny Committee can relate to each other in their meetings. So if you wanted something that was more definite in there, I'm sure we could come up with.
So I think it's simply that the Audit Committee doesn't miss some issue which has been discussed but not actually put in front of the Audit Committee.
Well, Chairman, if I may, can I just add to that? That would be the reason, Councillor, for not making it more detailed. So that is a bit of a catch-all sentence that's been added there. It's been added there because, in the interests of good governance, I would think that the Audit Committee would want to consider any issue that any of those officers decided to put before it. So I would advise against trying to specify that too clearly, because you've got a whole load of other things already within the terms of reference that talk about the specific things that the Audit Committee will do and what they will receive. The idea behind that is to make sure that if one of those principal officers brings an issue in front of the Audit Committee that doesn't that doesn't fall into any of those other definitions, that the audit committee will consider it. So personally, my advice would be leave it general because it is specifically intended to be general.
Thank you for the clarification. Is anybody else here from audit? Any other councillors sitting on audit? No. So Councillor Marriott, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I accept that. It's just that, you know, I just don't want to see things missing out. We don't be missing out on what could be an important issue. It's up to the officers to bring that to our attention. You know, we're not policing it ourselves.
So would you be happy to accept Robin's explanation? Thank you.
So, yeah, for the moment, we can see how that works.
Thank you very much. We'll suck it and see as we go.
Yeah,
It is, of course, as we all know, a living document at the moment, so changes can still be made, although obviously we want to try and avoid big changes if we can. Thank you, Councillor Ward.
That's sorry, Chairman. I had a comment to make. It picks up on what Councillor Hyman said earlier on. I mean, I've been through this document in some detail, not just what in the textual sense, but also how it looks, let's say, with the errors and typos and things. My view is it's actually needs a lot of work on that aspect. This, to my mind, is an important council document, and it should be a gold standard. And I would like to see that document produced in that framework, so to speak. So, for example, some sections have contents lists, some don't. Some have version control data, some don't. So there's a mismatch of standards within the document. And I think that should be reviewed to make sure it all looks the same, and it looks as though it's a professionally produced document. And that's just on the way it looks. It's not saying about the content, it's just how it's presented.
I would suggest, Councillor Marriott, if you would like to email Fiona with your suggestion.
I take your point. It was just a timing issue in order to get it out. So I am going through it and sort of double checking the proofing and the formatting. So I'm hoping that by the time the council agenda goes out at the end of this week, I'll have picked up all those consistency elements. Yes, but I take the point. It's not there yet, but we share the same ambition for the look of it and the quality.
But I'm happy to sit down with you and just go through the issues, or give you my marked up copy, and then you can choose.
If you've got a marked up copy, I'm happy and would like to leave it. I'm happy to take that. But let's say I take the point and share your ambition for the quality of the document as well.
Thank you. I'll leave it with you too.
Okay, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you, and I think we all want a gold standard. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And the reflection from Councillor Hyman, for example, I think reflected that as well. Councillor Ward.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, as you might expect, the bits that mostly caught my eye were council procedures and what the mayor can do. But before we go, can I say to Fiona, I think this is a magnificent piece of work. I think she's done a fantastic job with what was, I found, a very cumbersome document. And I now find I've got something that I can actually read with a certain amount of logic. And I find I'm not reading the same thing on sort of different pages in the document. So I think she's done a magnificent job, and I really do congratulate her. Two things I really liked, which have been mentioned before: a separate budget meeting, I think, is vital in view of what we had earlier last year. And mandatory annual training, I think, is absolutely definite for planners and the like. I have a typo, but I will save it to the end. Track changes, I've written constitutions and tried them with track changes. Track changes work if you're just changing a few sentences or a few words. There is no way I think I could read a track change of something like this, which is a massive change. So I certainly wouldn't want a track change. And Councillor Hyman made a comment on behalf of my group, the Farnham residents. He's not speaking for the Farnham residents. He is speaking for himself and himself alone. Can I go for a few points? Can I go to, I think it's page 130 something, annual meeting of council, article 1.2, little f. Give me a shout when you're there. I can't really read the numbers because I think it's 132, but there are numbers printed on top of each other. So they're a bit difficult. Anyway, annual meeting of council 1.2F, if you can find it. I'll try and see if I can decipher the page number. I think it's 130, but it might be something different. There's sort of something like 22 underneath it.
If it's the annual meeting, it's 132, I believe.
Yeah, okay, 132. Anyway, it's annual meeting of council, article 1.2, please. Okay. Yes.
Yeah, carry on, Councillor Ward.
Okay, it says here head of paid service. And if we look across the page to article 2.1E, we're talking about joint chief executive. I guess they should both say joint chief executive, should they not? Okay, thank you. Going on to article 14.12 B1, motion to proceed to the next business. Shout when you're there. Okay. If the mayor considers that the item has been sufficiently discussed, he will put that formal motion, which I assume is the motion to proceed to the next business, but correct me if I'm wrong, to the vote without further discussion. And if passed, then the council shall immediately proceed to the next item. In other words, they won't take a vote on the business currently being discussed. Is that correct?
No, I don't think so. I think the intention there is that where an item on the agenda, where a motion has been sufficiently discussed, that it then goes to the vote before moving on to the next item of the agenda. But as you've raised the question, perhaps we can pick up an action to have another look at the wording to make sure that it's a little bit clearer. But that's certainly how I read that motion.
Okay, thank you, Robin. Because the next one, little two, we put the procedural motion. So I suppose what I'm trying to work out is under little one, do we put the procedural motion to the council and then put the formal motion? In other words, or do we not vote on the procedural motion? So if you could just have a look at the wording of those two, because it just doesn't quite seem to flow correctly to me. Moving on.
Yes,
Sorry?
happy to. Yeah.
It just doesn't seem to quite work. Can I move on then to 25.1, remote attendance at meetings? If we look at this, members of the public can speak remotely, is A. B is representative of partner bodies can speak remotely. And then a councillor who has been appointed as a member of the committee is not allowed to speak remotely, but a councillor who is not a member of the committee is allowed to speak remotely. Now, I do understand that remote voting is not allowed, but it seems strange that a member of the committee should have slightly less rights than someone who's not on the committee.
So through you, Chairman, it's because of the rules around being considered to be in attendance. So we are constrained by or governed by, depending on how you want to look at it, the rules which say that those members of the committee are not considered to be present and therefore not able to vote unless they are physically in the room. So what we're doing with this rule is trying to put down in writing what we've already been following is a risk-averse approach where we don't want to have any challenge over decisions made by committees that aren't considered to be either present or able to vote. So we're trying to enable remote participation without undermining the lawfulness of our decision making.
Okay, thank you, Robin. I quite understand that, and I totally accept that. That's you know, if that's the way the law is, and the law is strange occasionally, then we're stuck with it. I think that's all of the things that came up to me. It all seemed to make sense. I think, you know, I think it's a cracking job and really difficult to do. And I think you've done a cracking job. Yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Ward. I would certainly agree with what you're saying. They've done a really good job to get this so far. If we can only find such minor things to actually change, then it just proves the point of what a good job they've done. Right. Now, I hadn't got anybody else. Councillor Knowles.
Thank you, Chairman. It's just on some of the licensing matters, which are on page, I think it's 163, yeah, onwards. And it lays out in detail the procedure to follow. I wonder if this would be something to say that this is rather guidance than statutory, because having chaired a number of these, it just doesn't flow like this, because quite often there's only one person here and they have their say and they don't want anything more to say. And there's virtually no members of the committee that ask anything. And this looks very complicated, and we do follow that if there's enough input. But quite often the person that comes here is very shy, doesn't want to say hardly anything at all. And I think it's for the chairman to make it flow as easily as possible for the applicant, for the, you know, whoever's sitting, been brought before the committee and colleagues. So rather than this be kind of laid down as we must, if this could be labelled guidance rather than kind of statutory, that we will go through every step of this, because sometimes, particularly if the person is very upset, which can happen, it's a little bit over the top. Thank you.
Robin, does this have to be laid down, or could guidance be a better word for it? I understand what Councillor Knowles is saying.
That's fine, that can be guidance. There are actually regulations, so statutory regulations around the Licensing Act 2003 hearings, but a lot of those relate to the sort of the before and after the giving notice, and then the appeals and the actual arrangements sort of in the room are more within the discretion. But it's just ensuring that we have, for a more complicated hearing, a procedure that reflects that it's a quasi-judicial process. But as you say, the chairman has the discretion to alter them to sort of fit the arrangements on the ground. So yes, we'll change that to procedural guidance rather than procedure rules.
Thank you, Fiona. Thank you, Councillor Knowles. Any other? Right. Councillor Baker, you'd like to come back?
Thank you, Chair. I'm very grateful to you for letting me come back. I did mark up a few things in here. I don't want to be nitpicking, but there's something I think maybe I could I take it up with Fiona Cameron outside the meeting, just because it's a question of interpretation of the use of a word. And but there is one other thing which on page well, it's under extraordinary meetings, and 3.1 calling extraordinary meetings, and little d says any 5 members of the council, if they have signed a requisition presented to the mayor and they have refused to call a meeting or have failed to call a meeting within 7 days, blah, blah, blah. The point being that the use of they here is ambiguous. It could relate to the mayor in the sense of he, she, or they, or it could relate to the 5 members of the council. I think it could do with being clarified.
Yeah.
And can I take up the other thing outside the meeting, please? We don't want to Shouldn't be drafting in committee.
No, that's fine. But we'll go that way if you could either do it by email or,
I'll be in touch with you tomorrow.
Thank you.
okay, thank you, Councillor Baker. Any other, Councillor Ward wants to come back. Anybody else first? Councillor Ward.
Thank you, Chair, for letting me come back. I can't find the page, but we are broadening the remit of the planning committees. Since our committees are done according to political proportionality, my question is, and certainly do come back on this later if necessary, but is it our intention to continue to have the political proportionality of, say, the Western Committee to be proportionate to the political representation in the Western area rather than the whole council? And obviously the same question for the Eastern area. That's my first, I hope the answer is yes, but that's my first point. Shall I just make the others both quickly and then get out of your hair?
Yeah, go ahead.
I may have missed it, but nowhere in the Constitution that I read could I find a definition of who defines the agenda for councils and who defines the dates on which council will meet. This is probably my myopia rather than anything else. But if it's not there, I think perhaps it ought to be. And if it is, if you could drop me an email and point me in the right direction, I'd appreciate it, because I found things about putting things on the agenda of executive, but I didn't find anything about the agenda of council. And a thing that might be worthy of note, the notice period for questions from members running out at midday on the day of a council meeting, I find rather short, and I find that generally it has caused considerable difficulties for the officers. I wonder if we might ask people to do it by midday on the day before.
Yeah, I think your last one is quite good. Fiona, are you happy with all three of those? Are you?
Multitasking. The going in reverse of those notice period for that would be members putting their name down to speak on agenda items. Moving the deadline to the day before, that's up to yourselves. That's not a legal requirement. That's a procedural matter for the council to decide. So if the committee wanted to propose that as a change,
Should we take
then
that point first?
Yeah.
Okay, Councillor Ward, are you going to actually propose that? Because if you are, we'll make a decision now, I think.
Chairman, yeah, I think it's a good idea. I'll propose it.
Can I have a seconder? Councillor Marrett, thank you. In that case, did you want to speak?
Yeah.
Carry on.
I think the practical difficulty, Councillor Ward, for that motion is that usually full council is held on a Tuesday. Most of the groups meet on a Monday, so they're really fresh before the meeting, and therefore you'll be having a group meeting after the deadline, which is a practical problem. You know, if we meet on a Tuesday and you're doing it the day before, you're doing it on a 12 o'clock on a Sunday, which means Friday, which means quite a long way before the meeting. So I think actually it's better as it is. Questions might be different, but putting your name down to speak to what was called part 2 items, I think would be not as democratic as it might be.
Thank you, Councillor Goodrich. Is there anybody else who wants to speak on this motion? I can't see. Councillor Gale?
Yeah, I'm actually, I think what Councillor Goodrich is saying is probably right. It gives people a little more time to read paperwork as well. Sometimes when you get your papers and then there's not a great deal of time before you've got to put in a question or you want to wish to speak or something. So I think shortening the time might be more difficult for some people.
Thank you, councillor Baker.
My point has been covered, thank you.
Anybody else want to speak? Okay, if not, councillor Ward, did you want to wrap up?
Not at all.
In that case, if you'd like to just repeat your motion briefly.
The motion is that we should have the midday on the day before for people wishing to speak rather than midday on the day of council, which causes untold difficulties for officers to scrabble around and get it all done.
Right, thank you. We're now going to take a vote on that. All those in favour of this motion, please.
It's 5 in favour.
Those against?
And 3 against.
Right, thank you very much. That motion is carried, so we'll put that through as an amendment. Thank you. Councillor Ward, had you finished? We've got another.
No, thank you very much. I raised a couple of points with Fiona about proportionality of planning committees and who sets council agenda. If she could give me an answer now, it'd be wonderful, but I'm prepared to wait.
Fiona.
Thank you. I'll let Robin pick up on the political proportionality of planning committees. The council agenda, I mean, so I think you also mentioned the dates of council meetings. Dates of council meetings are set as part of the annual calendar of meetings, which the monitoring officer has within his scheme of delegation to decide. I mean, they're pretty much sort of laid down in history, in that unless there is a sort of particular reason for moving them, they tend to be the same week of the same months, and sort of roll forward from year to year. And to a certain extent, they hinge around annual council, which in the year of an election has to be within 21 days of the election. Other years it has to be within March, April, May. We've tended to go mid-May. The budget meeting needs to be in February, in time to meet the statutory deadlines for setting the council tax. So we then work within a sort of a month or two in between the meetings, so that there's time for a couple of executive meetings generally, and then recommendations follow through to the next council meeting. So they tend to be sort of follow a fairly set pattern. In terms of items on the agenda, again, it follows a fairly set pattern in that there are the sort of formalities, and then there are the items coming through from the executive and the various committees, questions from councils, questions from councillors, questions from members of the public, motions put forward by councillors. If that sort of tends to cover most of the items on the agenda. We have the updates or the from the mayor and also from the leader. Again, there's quite a lot of sort of scope for that to pick up any sort of ad hoc items. So I think there is in the procedure rules a sort of summary of the main items that crop up on the agenda. If it was something that, for example, the mayor was wanting to add to the agenda, then I would suggest that they speak to the chief executive and the monitoring officer, and it can probably be accommodated. It's unlikely that it wouldn't be accommodated somehow. I don't know if that satisfies you, or if you would like something more specific in the constitution.
I'm very content and I'm very happy with your explanation about dates. That makes perfect sense, and I don't want to make a fuss about that. But if you have an agenda, I really think we ought to know who is responsible for putting it together. So let's say the leader wants something on the agenda. Does he go to the chief executive? Does he go to the monitoring officer? Does he go to the mayor? You know, I think somewhere, someone, like anything in life, somewhere someone should be responsible for putting for the agenda, so that if you want something on the agenda, you know who to go to or who to blame if you don't like it. I'm ambivalent who it is, although it probably should be an officer. It could be the mayor, but I'd rather not. Certainly, I don't think it should be the leader. But I just thought there should be a reference point there of who actually, if you like, signs off the agenda.
Thank you. Fiona, is that something you can answer now, or?
Sorry, I'll take that up with Robin offline. Councillor Goodrich.
Well, having been mayor about 20 years ago, I think we have the general items that are going to appear on the agenda, which are down in our rules. And of course, some of those, like receive, debate and respond to petitions, it's all set out on how that's done. Motions, it's set out how that's done and how you do it. And unless you can, unless it is covered by one of those, it doesn't appear on the agenda, it seems to me. Clearly, if you want to, for example, pay respects to the King or give wishes from the council on something or other, that I suspect is something that the mayor would want to put on the agenda. But everything else is really covered by the rules, which set out how, if you want to debate or have a motion, or it's all set out anyway. So I'm trying to envisage what item someone would want on the agenda that's not covered by the procedure rules. Apart from, as I say, giving royal, some. But the mayor again can, in his report, I suppose, say what he wants to do anyway.
Chairman, I would agree with that, if that's helpful. What appears on the council agenda, you've got the standard items, apologies, and the stuff that we all know will be there, and that's all set out within the constitution. Otherwise, it's decisions which are either coming directly to council because they have to, because they can't go anywhere else, they're a matter reserved for full council, or they're travelling from another committee. So, for example, this committee, you will be putting forward, perhaps, some suggested changes to the constitution. So then that appears as an item on the draft agenda. So from my perspective, I do agree with Councillor Goodrich on there, but I wonder whether in the wording for where we have set out what comes to council, we can just review that to make sure it covers everything that we think it covers, Mr. Mayor, and see if we can pick it up that way.
Okay.
Yeah, I won't make a huge fuss about it. I am just, I'm used to sort of someone being the fulcrum, the body responsible for a document such as that. But if the general view is that it is dealt with in the constitution, then I'm not going to make a fuss and I'll go along with it.
I think, sorry, I failed to pick up on that point. That role as the monitoring officer, as far as I'm concerned, I mean, the monitoring officer's name is on the front of the agenda, and if there's an additional item to come on there, then it's either going to be the monitoring officer or the members of staff working on their behalf. And as you say, as Councillor Goodrich says, civic and ceremonial items, from my perspective, is they can simply be added from the mayor. Paying respects, references to anything else civic or ceremonial, they can either come up in the mayor's announcements or they can actually be added as an item on the agenda. I think that, personally, I think it's okay to have that as part of the monitoring officer's discretion. Chairman, would you like me to pick up on the point about the planning committee?
Yes, please, the proportional representation.
So part 3, appendix 1, committee terms of reference, section 1.3 deals with Eastern and Western planning committees. So as this is currently written, as it's proposed, it defines the applications from which wards would go to which committee, but there's nothing that says in there that the members of those committees themselves have to be drawn from particular wards. So that was an intentional change. And if it's something which this committee wants to debate, then absolutely debate that. So that's in there as a proposed change, and we're looking to see what, as a committee, you think of it.
Okay, so there's obviously a debate to be had. Councillor Ward.
May I just make it clear, it was just the political proportionality that I was looking at. I wasn't trying to say that everybody on Western had to come from the Western area and everybody in Eastern had to come from the Eastern area, which is the status quo. I'm very content with the wording that moves on. I feel, since we have an Eastern and a Western, the natural corollary is that there should be proportionality of that area on that committee rather than general committee council proportionality. I won't go to the ramparts and die for this, but that's what I feel it should be.
Robin, did you want to come back on that or not? Have you explained your position?
I think it's probably for the committee to debate that. I understand entirely the point Councillor Ward's making. I think it's for the committee to discuss it.
Thank you. Councillor Goodrich.
Seems to me it must be the proportionality of what that committee covers. For example, taking an absurdity, if the whole of Western is full of Farnham residents and there are none in Eastern, we're not going to have a proportion of Farnham residents dealing with planning in Eastern. And therefore it seems to me that you're going to be looking at those wards that are covered by each committee, and if we have to do political proportionality, then it must be within that area, it seems to me, because the political proportionality in Eastern is going to be very different than the proportionality on Western, because of Farnham residents and other residents associations that may crop up.
So just to be clear, under the way it's currently written, there's no expectation that members are drawn from particular wards to sit on those committees. So it could be any member from across the authority, from any ward.
Councillor Knowles.
That can't
Oh,
be right.
sorry.
Thank you. Probably just confirm what I feared, which is that we're going away from local representatives doing the planning. So somebody from Councillor Goodrich's seat could be deciding on the Farnham matter. And we were there before, many years ago, I think before my time, but probably not yours, Chairman. And that's extremely unpopular with the public and gives Waverley a very bad name. So if you're going to sit on Western, I suggest that you should come from the wards that are covered by Western, not by people from the other end of the borough. Thank you.
My reaction is the same, that I've always felt that if you know your area, then you should represent that on planning. After all, the only people I'd be able to talk to, or most of the people I'd be able to talk to, are those that live within my community. And what I wouldn't want to have to do is travel to, I don't know, Dunsfold or Cranley somewhere to see what the community thought of something, so I could sit on Eastern planning. So I think I sympathise with Councillor Knowles. I'd rather have the two planning areas actually with ward councillors from those areas. Thank you. Councillor Ward, did you want to speak?
Yes, Chairman. As I understand it, and I think it's still true, that the group leaders put forward the people that they want on the various committees. And I actually feel that some representation from outside the area would actually be a healthy thing to keep some of our more, I'll use the word focused people with a broader view. I'm quite sure that our group leaders will concentrate their minds on putting people from the area in which they reside into these committees. But I actually quite like the idea which is expressed in there of being able to put people from a different area in there, just to keep an outside perspective on it. It was just the political proportionality that I wanted to raise. I'm very content with the way Robin has put together the wording otherwise.
Yeah, I can see your point, i.e. that if we're building a council estate somewhere, then it would be nice if somebody from the other side of the borough actually reflected what they had in their area and brought their expertise and knowledge to the other planning committee. Is there a debate about how far this should go? I mean, should we be talking about perhaps a maximum of 2 or 3 members outside of those planning committees to be on there? Would that be something that the committee would like to discuss?
Personally, I would just like to trust the group leaders to put some sensible people on there.
If we have them. Councillor Goodrich.
Yeah, I'm certainly against the idea that Eastern Planning would have anybody that's not from the wards that are listed in 1.2, and Western should have everybody on 1.3. I recall when we had Planning Committee A and Planning Committee B, which was a sort of haphazard group. It was very uncomfortable and didn't work well at all. The political proportionality is clear on 2.1. And currently we have on Eastern everybody who is in the wards in Eastern and so on. I wouldn't like to see the change, to be honest. So I wouldn't be in favour of people in Eastern popping over to Western to bail out the problems they might have in Western or vice versa.
Is there any other view from the officers before we continue?
No, Chairman, it's entirely for this committee. I mean, it's what's proposed here is a different model, a different way of doing it. And, you know, it will only be agreed if full council agrees it, but it will only be put forward to full council if this committee resolves to put it forward. So it is up to you ultimately as to what you think should be done. I will say it's been put in here, you know, on the basis that this is, you know, a regular, normal way of doing things and you know, a good way of governing committees in the officer's opinion. But it is something that you have to own. And so if you want to adjust this one before it goes forward to full council, then obviously that's something you can do.
I do remember somewhere in training in planning that one of the officers said, please remember, when you're planning and making decisions, it's lines on a bit of paper and rules that come down. So they were trying to say that despite the fact you lived in an area, it didn't really matter because any planner should be able to look at something and come to the same conclusion. However, we all know that there are emotions involved. We all know there are a lot of things to be said on behalf of the community, which isn't necessarily on lines and or regulations. However, I will continue. Councillor Knowles.
So, Chairman, I'd like to put an amendment, and we amend what it says by adding that members of the planning committee can only be drawn from the wards covered.
Have we a seconder? Councillor Goodrich, thank you. Who would like to speak to that?
Yeah, I think you know your area. It's very well saying yes, all the points on planning, you know, statistic points about an application, we all know. We could look at those in any area, but there are other things that people know about in their own area, and I think that's a very valuable thing that people bring forward to planning committees, be it for or against. And I think that's very necessary to be in your own area and vicinity. I don't know Farnham particularly well. If I sat on their planning committee in Western, I'd probably be quite lost. I'd have to be honest. It's a long way away from Whitley, but I know this area and I know the out to where Councillor Goodrich is. I know that area much better. So that would be my point.
Thank you. Councillor Nicholson.
Thank you. Well, I can see both sides of this, and in many ways it's rather nicer to have councillors represent their own particular area, where the wards where they live, and it's very clear. But at the same time, I think perhaps a little flexibility might be a bad thing. So I would be happy if there were, if you could have some mixing, providing it wasn't a major amount of mixing. I wouldn't like any more than perhaps 1 or 2 people moving across. I think that would dilute to some degree. So I'm prepared to support a general Councillor Ward's view, but again, providing it's done in a very modest way. And of course, it's up to the leaders of each group to actually to do that. I mean, they have to own this, and if the public don't like it, then they have to take the rap for that. Thank you.
Anybody else? Councillor Marriott.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I tend to agree with Councillor Nicholson's view. I'm not really bothered either direction because the rules have to be applied equally in both areas. So I can see the benefit of having an independent or separate voice, if you like, from the other wards coming into the particular committee. But either way, I'm not drawn either way strongly.
Thank you, Councillor Ward. You wanted to come back?
Yes, Chairman, sorry, you're hearing too much from me this evening, but I'm sorry, I set hairs running here that I didn't mean to set running. I was just inquiring how we were going to set the proportionality. The more I think about it, the more I think we should allow our group leaders to choose the people who they are going to put forward for the respective committees. And if the group leaders feel that people from outside the area might be a useful addition, we should trust them and let them do it. So I will be against the amendment.
Thank you, Councillor Baker, then Councillor Goodrich.
Thank you, Chairman. I think what guides me, it is for me really a matter of principle, is that planning is any planning applications that come to committee are significant and therefore will always be subject to evaluation of judgment. They won't inevitably be black and white. It's going to be a matter for perception. And I do think that local members are the best for doing that because they are familiar with many factors, and we do have very strong guidelines in planning as to what to take into account and what not to. So I think because it's so much a matter of judgment that I think it would be best for local members, as my ward colleague, Councillor Gale, has said.
Thank you, Councillor Goodrich.
Yeah, it was some year or two ago we abolished the Joint Planning Committee, which of course was looking at major applications for consistency across the borough. But looking at it from a practical point of view, if my leader said, I'd like you, Goodrich, to sit on Western and therefore not have anything to do directly in making decisions about your own patch, but making decisions about a patch the other end of the borough, I would decline the invitation, to be frank, because I would wish to be involved in matters that I understand that are on my patch, and I know the general area well, and to have to learn all the nuances of Hazelmere or Farnham would not be something I'd be prepared to do. And I suspect that quite a lot, if not all councillors, would feel that way. Fine in general principle, but would you be prepared, to sit on a committee totally outside your part of the borough? And therefore, although of course you can get involved in the applications that involve your ward by attending the other committee as well as a guest, it's not quite the same as representing or ensuring that the quasi-judicial function is carried out in your patch. So from a practical point of view, I would be very surprised if many councillors, if any, would be prepared to, at a request from a leader, to go and sit in another patch, to be frank. I think it's impractical and I think it's wrong, and I will vote in favour of the amendment.
Thank you. Does any other councillor wish to say anything? I'll just add my two penneth and say that I think I would trust the leaders to actually not flood a planning committee with too many members from the opposite side. And I would also agree that perhaps an outside view could be good for a planning committee. So yes, I think I would trust the leaders to get the balance and the perspective correct. Thank you. Anyway, we'll now go on to the vote. Can I have the amendment again, please, to make sure we know what we're voting on?
Did you get it down?
Yes, sorry. Yes, so I'm basically you're proposing that we retain the status quo, that the members from each of the committees are drawn from the wards that relate to where they're considering the planning application. So the wards as listed in the constitution. Sorry, that's a little bit mangled, but yeah.
I think we got all that. So all those in favour, please support the motion.
That's 4 in favour.
Thank you. All those against?
Also 4.
Yeah, thank you for that. Those abstaining? That's correct, isn't it? It's 8. Okay, obviously I have the casting vote and I shall go to the same way as I did when I voted. So the motion is lost. Thank you. Right, moving on. I'm a little bit low. I think, Councillor Ward, you've now finished, haven't you?
You'll be delighted to hear, Chairman, yes.
Thank you for that. I thought that's where we got to. So I'm now starting again for any other questions on the Constitution, not on any particular part of it. Councillor Baker.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm sorry to come back, but it does occur to me that if you are a member of a planning committee, in order to vote on an application, you have to remain in the meeting for the whole of the debate. There has been an opportunity up till now for the chair of a planning meeting to suggest a short break, actually as a comfort break. I think I will be, plain about it, that there are a number of us who actually do need a comfort break after a certain time. And I see the usual suspects trailing out of the chamber after me. So I don't know whether, I think I would quite like to see something put in the procedures for planning meetings, simply because the requirement to be in attendance is so absolute. And therefore, if you need to have a comfort break, you just have to manage it somehow if the chairman doesn't help.
I would hope the chairman would recognise that after, let's say, an hour, you would need a comfort break. Certainly on the planning committee I go to, then the chairman recognises that he will have a comfort break now and again, and will break the meeting up for that. I fully understand that it's very difficult if you're listening to a complete planning application. If you missed a bit, it could be that vital bit of evidence, and therefore if you go out halfway through or 2/3 of the way through a planning debate, it can indeed be difficult to come back in and then vote because you missed a lot of that information. I think I'd leave it to the chairman to have a comfort break when he thinks it's appropriate. And it may be perhaps if a member is discomforted between planning application, they could just ask the chairman if he would mind taking a 3-minute break. But I would, if we do this, please ask members to come back in that time, because otherwise you sit there looking around waiting for one member to return. Thank you. Anybody else? Councillor Goodrich.
Yeah, I mean, I think to put in the rules that comfort breaks are permitted and regulate how often and when and so on is difficult to put in the constitution. But there's always the chairman has got the discretion at any time to have a 5-minute, 2-minute, 3-minute break. It shouldn't be while a particular planning application is happening, because I think it's vitally important by law that everybody's present throughout and nobody misses anything. But I wouldn't suggest that we should put any rules in about it. It's worked perfectly well. It happens on Eastern and even on full council, you know, when we're freezing to death and people say that, you know, we should be allowed to warm up or get a blanket or get a drink or something if things are going on a long time. We've done it at full council, particularly when we were sitting with the windows open. So I just think we just have to use common sense and do it as and when necessary.
And Councillor Goodrich, is there anybody else wants to speak on this? Otherwise, we'll continue. Councillor Nicholson.
Thank you. I'll just make a brief comment, as others have said. Well, I think this is an excellent piece of work. It's clearly a great deal of work that has been done on it. It flows well, it's easy to search, and it's well paragraphed, which are short and clear. So it's I haven't said that, others have said that, but I would like them to make that point. Thank you.
Thank you. So is there anything else that anybody wants to raise on this part of the agenda? If not, then I'll go on to the where it is. Right, so the recommendation for this one is that the Standards and General Purposes Committee recommends to Council the revised Waverley constitutions, parts 1 to 4 approved. Now we have amended or added a couple of bits to it. Do you want me to go over those, or can we just take that as read?
I've got the amendment with regard to the giving notice to speak on what commonly known as part 2 items. So that would move to the day before, and I'll follow up with Councillor Baker and Councillor Marriott on their sort of more minor queries and the formatting aspect, and I'll complete the formatting corrections and proofreading before it goes to council. So I've picked up on those.
Thank you, Fiona. In that case, we'll go to the vote. All those in favour of the recommendation?
Thank you. I think that's unanimous.
Thank you very much. So that's the end of item 6. We'll now go on to item 7, which is amendments to the scheme of delegation, pages 229 to 272. Officer, is somebody going to present this one, Fiona? You could present, please.
Thank you, Chair. The scheme of delegation to officers allows the council to operate on a day-to-day basis without recourse to the council and its committees for decision-making where that's appropriate. As set out within the covering report, and we did cover this recently in this meeting, I use my delegated authority to amend the scheme of delegation to reflect the post titles in the new joint management team. And this was to ensure that the existing authorities already granted by full council could continue to be exercised under the new structure. In addition to those amendments, which are automatic, there are proposed amendments within this item. Colleagues in our planning team have requested a number of substantive changes to the scheme of delegation to the Executive Head of Planning and Development, and you can find that on page 255 of your agenda pack, and they're described within paragraph 4.3 of the covering report. The proposed amendments are for the purposes of streamlining and speeding up decision-making in relation to planning applications and tidying up the scheme of delegation. Sally Busby, Business and Performance Manager, and Chris French, Development Lead for Strategic Sites, sitting to my right, both from the Planning Department, are both present this evening to respond to your questions about the reasons for the proposed amendments. And of course, Fiona and I are happy to follow up with any support as well, if you need it. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. So this is now open to questions. Can I ask one thing? Mr. French, do you need to be here? I'm not quite sure. Is planning in this part?
Yes, because the proposed amendments have come forward from officers. As you know, we have, this committee will hear proposed amendments from various quarters. Sometimes it comes from me or from the Democratic Services team. Sometimes it comes from political groups or from individual councillors. And sometimes it comes from staff and managers within the organisation.
Thank you. So then questions from councillors, please. Any questions from councillors? Everybody looking around, look. It looks like the officers have not only spent a lot of time on this, they've got it right. Councillor Hyman, I understand you've registered for a question or a statement. Councillor Hyman, over to you. You have 4 minutes.
Thank you. Yes, this is. I see that this appears to be a duplication of part of the Constitution. So my first question will be: is 3.1 here, the scheme of delegation, the same as 3.1 that's in the papers? You know, a number of pages before. It seems to be in there twice. So correct me if I'm wrong, please. One little point of the Environment Act 1995, which is mentioned many times throughout, is now the Environment Act 2021. And obviously, if we're updating it, we should update the legislation accordingly where we know that it's necessary. And there may be others. So if I could just ask that could be checked, or whether I take it up with officers outside of the meeting. But I would say, for instance, that is in L4 on page 18 of this item. I don't know the page number of your committee papers in front of you. I noticed O2 is good. Most people would agree with the change to O2, but why is it only affordable housing where the delegation to officers exists? Because there are other significant changes made to Section 106 agreements, and we'd like to have one coming forward soon on a major scheme in Farnham, where permission probably would not have been granted had it been those changes been known at the time, like with affordable housing. So I think we need to look seriously at that, and I'll take it up outside the meeting if you don't have time to discuss it here. In 01, this is a change which isn't proposed but ought to be. It says that it's regarding where decisions have been made to refuse permission on habitats grounds, and says that where these are resolved, and the question of course is who decides and how that it's been resolved, because I mean obviously if the people or persons involved may well have been proven by the courts to have been wrong for 15 years, and I certainly wouldn't be happy with the idea of someone deciding it was resolved without actually resolving it in accordance with the law. So and you know, that's the production of a complete appropriate assessment of the mitigation. I think, as all members are probably aware, I raise it regularly because it's still true what I'm saying. The law, it's cleared and it's not satisfied yet. So you know, how do we define that resolved in 01, which is a big issue. On page 26 of the document, A3, it says there's now under 3 weeks to call in planning applications. That should be 3 weeks after the publication of an appropriate assessment, because the courts have found that consultation on appropriate assessment must be carried out. Paragraph 39 of People Over Wind, I think, if I recall correctly. Correct me if I'm wrong. It's put in law the Aarhus, which is an international agreement which we're party to and we are signed to, as a requirement to consult on appropriate assessments. If I refer to, I've just managed to find the page numbers for these two, page 237 of your papers, Chairman. It increases the number of objections required to call in a planning application.
20 seconds, Councillor Hyman.
thanks, from 5 to 10, and very local applications, that may be difficult. So, you know, we're reducing residents' right in a way. It's the validity of objections that counts, not the number, I think. And on page 250, the last sentence on page 250 says that this has got to be read alongside the Constitution. Well, it's part of it, isn't it? So I don't know why it says that. If you could just clarify on that. But I think that, you know, some of these matters I need to take up with the officers outside of the meeting.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Hyman. I think we captured all of those. Right, are there any you want to answer now, or do you want to take some offline, or how would that go with you?
Sorry, what's the question, Chair?
The question is there anything you can answer now, or do you want to take it offline with Councillor Hyman later?
In terms of the final point about the wording which says the scheme and delegation to officers must therefore be read in conjunction with the council's constitution, I agree with Councillor Hyman that the scheme and delegation is essentially part of the constitution, so we can reword that. The point it's trying to make there is don't look at the scheme of delegation in isolation. It needs to be read alongside all these other pages within the constitution. But yes, I didn't hear anything else from what Councillor Hyman said that prompted me to think that we needed to make any other changes to the proposals in front of you today. So I'm assuming that the committee will now discuss the proposals in front of it today under this item, but that's obviously for you, Chair, to determine.
Yes, absolutely. Anything for Ione you wanted to add to that? Right, so we'll go back to where we were. So Councillor Knowles.
Thank you, Chairman. On pages 26 and 27, I'm looking, one matter was mentioned by Councillor Hyman, but at little a point 3 on 26, where within 3 weeks of an application appearing on the weekly list, the planning applications, the chair and vice chairman of the relevant planning committee and the ward member. So should that not be chair or vice chair or ward member? Because that's how I understand it is at the moment. One person can call it in. This is now going to that 3 people have to get hold of each other within that period and all agree. And I don't know that that's what we expect. And also then at little FG on page 27, we're removing the 5 or more letters of objection and making it 10. I take it that's to make it easier for officers to proceed. We've already got a bad reputation with planning. I think this would enhance that bad reputation. And I would oppose the change to 10 from 5. There has to be some way that the public can express their views, and this looks to be totally trying to shut that down. Thank you.
Does any officer want to answer the first part of that about the 3? Is that correct?
The way, to be clear on this item, every change is tracked. So what you're seeing there is the current setup, the current requirement. It may be that what you're experiencing is something different from what's set out in the Constitution, but that is, you know, the black text within the Word document, within the paper is what's set out within the current Constitution, and the blue text is the suggested change.
Thank you. Let's
Just Chairman has a point. There isn't any blue text, it's all black. So Robin's referring to the blue text. Well, we can't tell because it's not here.
That's a fair point, Chairman. So it's either the underlined text or the struck through text, which you hopefully will be able to see within black and white copies.
Yeah, I can see the struck out text and I can see the underlining. Thank you. Does anybody else want to take up a debate on these 2 points raised by Councillor Knowles? Councillor Gale.
Yeah, from my knowledge, it's been relevant for just a ward member to request something to be called in. I've called things in and haven't had to contact a chairman and vice chairman. So we've obviously been going against what it said in the regulations. So could we change it so it could be either or? And also, I don't think it should be changed to 10, 5 people requesting something to be called in from a relevant area. I think is what it should stay as.
Thank you, councillor Baker.
Thank you, Chair. Totally agree with that. I'd like to say in favour of keeping, if I'm right, that we are keeping 5 letters of objection. That this really counts in rural areas where there aren't so many neighbours to where there's an application, and it does have to be applied proportionately in those rural areas. So I think there's a lot to be said, and I do have every sympathy with planning officers having to prepare reports for committee, but I don't see, I think the 5 letters of objection has more merit. Thank you.
Councillor Goodrich.
Yes, I would agree with councillor Baker. Being in a very rural area as I do, I have some applications that are right on the edge of the borough and in the middle of the countryside, where the number of buildings that are overlooking are very small, and therefore the objections are small, but it's nevertheless a very contentious matter generally. And I have had the experience that when I have written to Plan Consult and the planning officer concerned and say, if you're minded to pass this one, I want it to go to committee because it is a contentious application. I haven't had to, either the chairman and vice chairman have just gone along with what I've asked, or I've ruled. I agree. So perhaps we could clarify how the planning department actually operate when I, as a ward member, say this application is a hot potato, please can it appear on the agenda if you're minded to pass it, is how it's actually handled in reality, whether it does go to the chairman and the vice chairman, or whether the ward councillor rules the roost. You've still got to persuade the planners that there's an issue that is worthy of debate, rather than I just don't like it and there's no good planning reason to disagree with what the planners are putting forward. I accept that, but I think it's worked, but from the members' perspective so far, but as it is, except for the A3, which I think is something which, well, it's A, isn't it? It's A3, where I don't think that's actually operated in reality, but I would, Chairman, welcome what the planning department say it happens in reality.
Yes, Vice Chairman, I often get asked the question in our briefing, and then we debate it amongst us, and then if we decide perhaps it's not the idea, we go back to the ward council and debate it again. However, if I could have an official answer from the officers, please.
Thank you, Chair. There's two points there. The one to do with the and and the or, and the other to do with the number of representations. The and and the or is a really interesting point that's being raised, and I think that it would be open to you to put forward a motion that should actually say or, rather than requiring us to go from the ward member to each of the people listed in that part of the in that part of the scheme. So you could put that forward as a suggested amendment. The point with the 5 to 10, that's just the point where we would notify the ward members as to whether there had been that number of representations, and that would give an opportunity for calling. The reason we're suggesting 10 is because we have felt on occasion that that 5 threshold was too low, but what we also are mindful of is that even if there were a lower number of representations, there would be that 21-day period from when we publish our weekly list that would allow members to call it in anyway. So that wouldn't be removed. So you would still have the ability to call something in that had a lower number of representations, albeit you'd be doing that early in the process when 21 days is running. So that's all that I was going to say, Chair.
Thank you. We seem to have the two here. One which seems reasonably straightforward about the amendment on the first part, A3, Is there anybody who wishes to put forward an amendment for that on A3? Councillor Knowles?
Yes, I think from what we've heard and what I said, I think we replace the word "and" with "or" where it appears, and vice chairman and relevant ward member. So we replace it with "or."
Everybody happy with that? Agreed. Thank you very much. All right. So the second one, which is the change between 5 and 10. Can we have a debate on that? Is there any councillor wish to speak on that? Councillor Knowles again?
Yeah, as I raised it in the first instance, and having heard what the officer says, I still think we should be at 5, because very rarely do I get a notice that there's 5 objections. And it may be the first time you've heard about it from your residents. You wouldn't have called it in if you hadn't known of the feeling and looked at the matter. So it alerts the ward member to what is happening. And as colleagues have said, in the quieter areas, to get to the 5, they find difficult. To the 10 will be impossible. So I think so that there is some democratic representation on this council, we should stay at 5.
Councillor Baker?
Thank you, Chair. I'm just going to say that anything that helps us members is very welcome, because sometimes we can struggle with our workload. So I have a lot of sympathy with the officers on this point, but I'd really be glad for a reciprocal thing coming in our direction. It's just a notification. It's just drawing our attention to something. And it may be that we don't think it should be called in anyway, but it's just giving us the heads up. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other councillor? Councillor Knowles, you want to put a motion up for this one as well?
Yes, that in FG we revert from 10 to 5 wherever it appears.
Thank you. Any seconder? Maxine Gale, thank you. In that case, we'll go straight on to vote. All those in favour of Councillor Knowles' amendment?
That's 7 in favour.
Those against? And an abstention. I knew you were there somewhere. Right, so both of those have now accepted. Councillor Gale.
Sorry, councillor, item C has been deleted, and I don't know why it's been deleted, because I think we should look to be above board, because if people who are related to or working for the council, I think at least it should be highlighted in a way. I know sometimes it takes a while for the officers to have to sit through a planning meeting, but I just think we should be seen to be looking at those, not just waving them through. Sorry.
Yeah, my experience obviously on the planning committee has been that when they come up, we generally accept the officer's view because they're not the officers that have submitted it. And the fact is that we're getting a lot through that really goes to a committee, and we can spend 15 minutes on it, which is something that would have, generally speaking, just been nodded through. I like the idea of transparency, but on the other hand, I think efficiency also must come into it. So my own perspective is that I'd be in favour of this, though I do agree there may be a way of perhaps highlighting that a number of them have gone through. I don't know, but I'd be happy to accept this. Right, anybody else, please? Doesn't seem to be any other speakers on it, so unless anybody wants to say anything, we'll accept that as it is. Thank you. Right, anything else? Since in the first place, I think we're doing well here with this particular part of the document, so it's well written, obviously, and acceptable. So in that case, if there's no other questions on it, we'll go to the recommendation when I go back to my bits of paper. Right, so the recommendation is, this is item 7. It is recommended that the Standards and General Purposes Committee endorses the proposed revisions to the scheme of delegation and recommends that version 7.1 of the scheme of delegation be approved by council. All those in favour? That looks unanimous. Thank you very much.
Just to be clear, Chairman, that was as amended. As amended.
Apologies, as amended. I think I'm going word blind. Well, that was a surprise. It just came to a sudden end. I was looking for something else to put on there, but there doesn't appear to be anything else on the agenda. So, ladies and gentlemen, can I thank you very much for your attendance tonight? I can only reiterate what lots of us said to the officers, but please pass on our thanks to all those involved, not just the officers here tonight, but all the officers that have taken part in this, because we have so very few questions in it. As I said before, I think it's a very well put together document, and I would like to thank all of them here for that and for their continued work that I know they're going to get emails on to actually tweak it a little bit. So thank you all very much, and that will eventually come out the other end at the full council for us to vote on. Is there anything else you wanted out of this tonight, Robin?
I think from me, Chair, no.
In that case,